Thanks, man. No. Yeah, hey everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to talk about the infrastructure for Rust, what it keeps to take it running. Given that this title slide is exactly the same that I had for my RustConf talk, I'm just curious if anybody here has seen said talk and kind of how concerned you are that I'll just be giving the same talk again. Thanks, my colleagues have a lot of trust in me. Today, I want to talk about a few slightly different topics than last time. We're going to start with a general introduction to kind of the infrastructure that the infrastructure team operates, the things that you as users of Rust might use, the things that we provide for developers of Rust. We're then going to talk a little bit about the current state of Rust, like where is Rust in kind of its growth trajectory, where are we as a project? Because I think it's really important to kind of zoom out a little bit and consider where we are and what role Rust plays in the world. And I'm going to go deep into this, I think we really reached the point where Rust is critical infrastructure. And with that come new risks that we need to talk about, that we need to kind of be aware of, especially if we think ahead what the next 10, 5, 20 years might look like. And that means also new challenges for the infrastructure team, how we operate and kind of the infrastructure that we provide. I want to quickly introduce myself before jumping too far ahead, because it might be interesting for you to know who I am and why I speak about this. I'm one of the two co-leads of the infrastructure team in the Rust project, where I can thankfully work full-time because I get paid by the Rust Foundation to work on Rust as my full-time job. I want to start this with a small disclaimer, which is that I'm not here as either a representative of the Rust Foundation, nor do I speak for the infrastructure team. This is a very kind of personal talk that I want to give about my view on where we are as a project and what kind of conclusions I draw from this. I have a lot of conversations, of course, with people in the foundation, in the team, in the project, and the broader community that really shape these views. But this is really me speaking from the heart, essentially, about a topic that I've been thinking about a lot over the last year and a half. And as promised, we're going to start with our infrastructure. We're going to have a brief look at the most important pieces. And I think, generally speaking, we think about the infrastructure that the team operates as tools and services that are used to both develop the language and help people use Rust. And we can group this by kind of the people that the infrastructure serves, where on one side we have contributors to the Rust project. And for the contributors, one of, I think, the most important services that the infra team operates is our continuous integration. Every commit that gets pushed to the default branch of Rust is extensively tested. And we build release artifacts, and we upload them so that we can then do a lot of cool downstream activities, like regression testing on a by-commit basis. We can look at performance regressions in the compiler. And all of this is done in our CI test suite. And that's a massive kind of piece of infrastructure that a lot of people are working on, and a lot of people are trying to optimize it to make CI faster and faster so that we can merge more features into Rust. Another kind of big or very important, I think, part of our infrastructure is a tool called Crater, which allows the compiler developers in particular to run experiments against the Crate's ecosystem. So every kind of new feature or every bigger change in Rust can be tested against pretty much all of Crate's I/O to figure out if there are any breaking changes, if new features would accidentally break large parts of the ecosystem. And this is, to geek out a little bit, it's really nice infrastructure. It's one of the ones that, it's quite fun to work on because it essentially does nothing for most of the time, but then when someone wants to run an experiment, we spawn up a ton of servers to kind of build a ton of crates in the background. And finally, but not unimportantly, the infra team is responsible for a ton of GitHub apps and a ton of bots that help maintainers, most importantly, to kind of do their daily work. We have a ton of tools to help people triage issues, to coordinate teams, and to kind of merge PRs into kind of the main line. And for anyone who's like ever contributed to Rust, I think the two bots that pretty much everyone eventually gets in contact with is Triage bot and then Boars. And yeah, if you want to hear me rant about Boars, find me later. On the user side, it's a little bit simpler, but I would say more critical. Because most importantly, I think we have the Rust releases that we provide, where the infra team maintains the tooling that is required to take these release artifacts that CI builds and repackage them as a Rust release that you can download with Rust up. And it's not just the tooling part to kind of build the release, it's also the infrastructure that serves the release, like that makes you or gives you the ability to download this, which is a bunch of like content or like, yeah, 2 content delivery networks that we run. And the infra team helps with the development or like the underlying infrastructure of Crates.io and Docs.rs. Like we don't help with the development of the applications, but we help those teams run their service by, for Docs.rs, providing a server, for Crates.io helping, again, with kind of the distribution of crates, making sure that people can actually download the crates that are in Crates.io. And I want to take a brief second to kind of introduce this concept of our content delivery networks, because it's something that's really important as we look at kind of the growth of Rust. We have like lucky, happy users on the right who, when they try to download Rust or download a crate, will hit one of our CDNs. And a CDN is essentially like a globally distributed network of servers that help us serve content locally close to users. So users from the US will download a release from a server in the US. People in Asia will download it from a server in Asia. And that's not only faster for the user, it also is a lot cheaper for us, because traffic that goes through CDNs is just a lot cheaper than traffic that would go directly to our storage. And especially as we start considering the growth of Rust, it's one of the main tools that we have in our kind of arsenal to manage how our costs change over time. And it's really kind of important to consider, because we'll get back to this in a sec. Because let's talk about the current state of Rust. Like, where are we as a project, as a community, as a language? And I think the first and like most obvious answer is that Rust is growing. And what I can tell you, and what you'll see in the data in a few seconds, is that Rust is growing exponentially. If we had to summarize it really simply, it's the rocket ship going to the moon. It's both really like incredible to see how quickly Rust is growing, how quickly the adoption is growing. But it's also really scary if you're on the other side of this and kind of see how much infrastructure we need to provide to keep up with that curve. And I want to run through like a few examples that like highlight this growth. And I think the first like obvious one is just looking at the star count on GitHub. And this is like the prime example of an exponential growth curve. We see that Rust is still growing fast, and we see that the growth is accelerating as well. Like every year we get more and more users. It's not that we add the same amount of users every year, the curve goes up steeply. And I think we can look at the ecosystem. In 2017, like I found this randomly in the internal forum, like in 2017 we celebrated 100 million downloads of the 7,500 crates that existed at a time. And we're now 7 years later. And this is from last week. I checked today's date. Last week we had 58 billion crate downloads. This week we're already at 59, like somewhere in like the 59.5 range. That is total. Those are the total downloads. Similarly, we have last week we had 140,000 crates on Crates.io. This week we're already at like 141. And I think this number, like this absolute number, is of course super impressive. We're very proud of this, but it's also starting to lose its value in a way, because it's going up so fast. When I started and when we started looking at this in more depth or in more detail, when we started tracking this, we added like 1 billion downloads per month, roughly speaking. That was like a year ago. And now we're at like 3 billion per month. So in just a year, we 3x'd the amount of downloads that we get. So if we look at this number, and like you see this slide is already out of date. Like I took this screenshot last week with 58 billion, now it's 59. We're growing incredibly fast, and the size of the ecosystem is growing really, really quickly. And this is kind of our bandwidth chart that we track internally, which shows this growth as like a very constant line, where if we kind of predict a little bit where we'll end up, between October and October, we'll at least double our traffic, and I think it's not unreasonable to expect that we'll triple it even. Also, shout out to Christmas. It's always fascinating to see that dip. And this growth in our traffic is, I think, one of the most reliable figures that we have to really show how the ecosystem is growing. Year over year, we've doubled our traffic, and there's no sign of slowing down. And for this year, we're predicting that low estimate is like around 4 petabytes per month. High estimate is like somewhere in the range of 5. And I think the scary part is that there's no end to this. And it's one of the reasons why I have like this Fastly dedication slide in here, or like appreciation slide in here, because our bandwidth is growing like crazy. Fastly is one of our CDN providers, and roughly every 6 months or so, we have a call with Hannah, who gave the keynote, to very kind of kindly and like carefully warn her that we're still doubling, and that since we've talked last, it's double again, and just to make sure if that's okay, and if we need to like put anything in place to make sure it don't go over any like bandwidth limits that we have. And it's awesome. Like I have to say, I love Hannah. Like every time we just get a massive congrats and a very proactive question of like how much more we need essentially in the next few years. It's fine. We can grow. And that's such a massive relief for us as the infra team, because managing this growth is a real challenge. And if we had to kind of struggle to figure out what to do with this bandwidth and how to serve it, we would all be a lot more stressed. So massive shout out to Fastly for being a great sponsor. I think the other area that we can really see how Rust is kind of growing as a community and as an ecosystem is looking at the adoption of Rust and like who is using Rust. And I think this one, for anyone who follows Rust, this tweet got shared around a lot last year when the CTO of Microsoft Azure shared that Rust components are now part of like the Windows 11 preview builds at the time. So we made it into Windows, which is, exciting. Last year, we also got into the Linux kernel on somewhat of an experimental basis, but we're there. We're in Linux now, which is interesting to consider. Like 2 of the major operating systems in the world are now relying on Rust to essentially ship features to users. And I found this blog post from 2021 already, where the Android team is talking about how they look at Rust as a solution to write more secure low-level drivers for the Android operating system. And Android is used by billions of people per month. Like, it is a massive thing. It's probably like the biggest operating system that exists in the world, and being part of that operating system is like a very kind of, big achievement for us as a project. And seeing how all of those big operating systems kind of rely on Rust, I think, is something where we really both should kind of celebrate ourselves a little bit, but also it is something that we need to consider as we think ahead for the next 10 years or so, because it changes and it changes the nature of the project. We also see a ton of investment in Rust, and like those are all the member companies of the Rust Foundation, which is like the easiest way for me to get like a screenshot of a ton of companies that like put money into Rust. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg. We have companies who invest in the Rust Foundation, but we also see investment in the ecosystem. For example, at conferences like this, where tons of companies are sponsoring these conferences. Companies are sponsoring developers and projects on GitHub, and companies are hiring people to work full-time, either with Rust as Rust developers in their company, or they hire them, similar to like my role, to work full-time in the Rust project. So it's not just that companies are using it, companies are also seeing the value of Rust and investing actively into the ecosystem. And kind of the last data point that I want to share is this press release that the White House posted at the beginning of the year, which makes the bold claim that like all future software should be memory safe, which I think, putting on my Rust Foundation hat for a second, we're of course all in agreement with. But I think this is something that's like, it marks an important milestone in the lives of the Rust project as well, where I think we as an industry, and not just the industry, but also governments, are recognizing the need to build software in a more secure and reliable way. And with someone like an institution like the White House pushing for the adoption of memory-safe languages, if you look at the list of what is considered a safe language, the list is not very long. And to be honest, I don't find the list very interesting. It's mostly like safe subsets of C and Ada. So if I, as a developer, would look at the list, I would be very interested to try Rust. And I think all of those data points together, seeing the adoption in the industry, seeing the growth of the community, of the ecosystem through just the sheer number of codes that get developed, and then seeing that there is an active kind of push from both industry and governments to rethink how we build software, I think it kind of leaves only, or leads to an interesting question that I kind of want to reflect a little bit on with you together, which is, if we look at the state of Rust as like this growth curve, if we look at how the project has developed, I think there's a line somewhere. And that line is very hard to define. And it's very, very difficult to know where it is, how it looks, how it feels to cross it. You can essentially only see it in hindsight when you look back and you compare 2024 with 2017, for example. And I don't mean this in like a negative or like a derogatory way, but I would classify what's below the line a little bit as like it's a hobby or it's a research project. It's a phase where the project is defined and characterized by a need, like a push for innovation, where there's a lot of exploration and experimentation happening. And I put hobby here because I think it's really, really important for us to remember that Rust was mostly developed by volunteers in their free time who had the passion to invest their nights and weekends into this project. Rust was not built by a team inside Google or inside Facebook. It is built mostly by a volunteer-driven organization. And that has created or has shaped our culture, how we operate as a project, why we contribute, why we like being part of the teams that we're a part of. Because it's a very kind of dynamic, it's a very passionate and energetic culture that we're in. But projects in this phase, like, they don't get used to build cars or rocket ships or control nuclear reactors because the technology is not mature enough yet. Everyone understands that at this stage, we're all early adopters. We're giving something a chance. We're trying something new. But there's still chance for breakages, for bugs, for security issues. And I think this is what differentiates this phase from what comes after this line, where suddenly we're in a professional environments where people use Rust to achieve very specific goals and use it for tasks that require a much higher degree of like trust and reliability in the language. And if we look back, if we compare 2017, the 7,500 grades, for example, with 2024, where we have 141,000, I think it's clear to say that if we look back, we've probably crossed that line. Like, it's a completely different game now. And similarly, all the metrics that we looked at, the exponential growth in our bandwidth, the investment that goes into Rust, I think it's safe to say that for Rust as a project, in large parts, we outgrown kind of this early phase of experimentation and innovation where we can move fast and break things. And as people start relying on us, we have to kind of reconsider our relationship to the users of Rust. Because I think the message that I really want to kind of leave you with here is that, in my opinion, Rust has become critical infrastructure for the internet, and because the internet is everything now, kind of the societies that we live in. Rust is something that we cannot go without anymore, and it's something that needs a lot of kind of trust and a lot of stability. And it's interesting to me, I really like that Hannah talked about trust just now in the keynote, because I think it's something that shapes what it means to, or what we need to kind of emphasize. Rust being critical infrastructure means that it's also used in critical applications. Being part of Linux, Windows, and Android means that most of the world population probably has access or comes in contact with something that runs Rust. It means that eventually our tools will be in places that, run hospitals, run nuclear reactors, or control spaceships and cars. It also means that people rely on Rust. And what I mean with this is, in particular, they use it at their work, where their personal career suddenly becomes wrapped up in what Rust is and how well Rust does. They adopt Rust at work to achieve a very specific goal. There's something that you want to achieve as a company, something that makes you money, that keeps the company alive. And if, in the worst case, you fail with that, maybe the company goes under. So there's suddenly a much bigger risk to adopt Rust. And people need to invest social capital into the adoption of Rust. They need to go out and make a point of why Rust is the right tool for the job. They need to convince their boss or their boss's boss or a whole engineering organization. And that requires social capital. And I think it's really worthwhile to consider that every company, every place that uses Rust right now had someone who pretty much staked their personal reputation to advocate for Rust in that environment. And if that project would have failed, it would have really reflected poorly on them. It would have shown bad judgment for them as an engineer. And I think this is something that we need to be mindful of people who work on a language, who work on the infrastructure, and who push for the adoption of Rust, because we need to give people essentially a solid foundation to stand on and not make them risk their career. Because that is what's happening now. People are building their careers on Rust. Everyone, my guess is, who comes to this conference eventually dreams of being a Rust developer full-time, because we all love the language. We want to use it daily. I don't miss the days of writing PHP. And I want to be successful in my career. I want to have Rust on my resume, but it also means that I want Rust to succeed, because only if Rust succeeds, me being a Rust developer is something that I can build on in future jobs. If Rust fails and I need to go back to PHP, I have nothing to show essentially on my resume that tells people that I actually know what I'm doing, which is true, by the way, with PHP. So again, I'm really happy that Hannah talked so much about trust, because I think it's something that is vital for the phase that we're in as a project. It's something that is really hard to build and really easy to lose. And as Rust becomes critical infrastructure, as we essentially build something that people depend on, I think it's important that we consider trust pretty much as the core of what we need to manage and what we need to maintain. Because only if people trust Rust and the project and the community will we be successful. And I think looking at this from the perspective of the infra team, there are three things that really play into this, which is availability, reliability, and security. We need to make sure, in particular as an infrastructure team, that people are able to use Rust whenever they need to use Rust. If our CDNs are down 7 days of the week, or 5 days of the week, or 3 days of the week, it doesn't help people actually rely on it and use it at work. And similarly, what we ship needs to be reliable. It must, or it has to work in those applications. We can't ship something that only works sometimes or in some circumstances, or maybe the compiler produces the right result and maybe it doesn't. And I think the most critical part is really security. Rust has made this one of its core promises. It's why people are interested in Rust. It's why governments advocate for Rust as a solution to this memory unsafe problem. And I think because we tied that so closely to kind of the identity of Rust, it's the one criteria that can lose us trust the fastest. Systems fail. There are mistakes. Once in a while, Cloudflare goes down and takes the internet down with them. That's fine. People have come to kind of learn to live with that. I think with the security, it's much more difficult. If we mess up on the security front, it has a much, much stronger impact on the trust that we lose. And I think there's kind of a circular dependency between trust in Rust and the reputation of Rust as a safe choice and as a solution to problems. As people use Rust, try it out, have positive experiences with it, it builds trust. And they go out and share this experience with their friends, with their colleagues, with other parties. which helps build reputation. People associate Rust suddenly with something that is good to build on, that's a safe choice that you can bet your career on. But as we do things that damage our reputation, if we do things that lose us trust, this stops working. Like this flywheel that now accelerates our growth is something that we need to kind of carefully care for and protect. Because again, our success as a project, in my eyes, is tightly coupled to the trust that the industry has in Rust. And I want to kind of really quickly go through a few things that I think are important to consider on this front. Like, what are the things that contribute to the trust that the community has in Rust? What is the critical infrastructure that the team operates that has an impact on this? And I think first, because I've talked about this a bunch, we get back to the content delivery networks, because they have the most immediate impact on availability. If we make mistakes in our CDN, people cannot download crates or cannot download releases. And that's a very obvious problem. And I can say this from experience, because in 2023, early last year, I managed to accidentally delete one of the DNS records for crates.io, which meant that within like 5 minutes we had people in Zulip asking why their CI fails, why they can't download crates, why Cargo doesn't build anymore. And it took 15 to 30 minutes to get back up, during which no one in the world could download Rust releases, because I made a small mistake in a configuration. And I think this is something that differentiates the infrastructure team a little bit from other teams, where what we do has an immediate and global impact. If you push a bug into the main branch, there's a 6-week beta period where we hopefully find it. With infrastructure, whatever change we push is live globally immediately and potentially has global consequences. The other thing that I want to call out is like, because I think this is like very underappreciated and honestly also somewhat under-maintained part of our infrastructure is our website. People who want to adopt Rust, this is the place where they first make contact with the language. So it's important that this is up, that it's up to date, and that it gives you the right information that you're looking for. It wouldn't look good on us if like the website was down all the time. But because I think it's something that is not, it's not a part of our technical deliverable, it's not something that people rely on in their day-to-day once they adopted Rust, it's easy for us as a project to forget that this is an important part of our, essentially our reputation. We also have CI, which, because we built the release artifacts there, it's really important that it produces a reliable result and that it is secure, that people cannot push their backdoor into our release artifacts because we accidentally, I don't know, do something wrong. And this is something that, a lot of people are working on to make sure that this produces exactly what it is supposed to do. And similarly, we have the release tooling that takes these release artifacts and like makes them into something that you will download through RustUp. And there's a ton of work going on right now to make sure that we increase our kind of security posture, that we sign stuff in a stronger cryptographic way to really give you the confidence that whatever we push from CI and that eventually becomes a release, that thing cannot be tampered with ever, especially if we look into kind of a far future where we want to have mirrors for all of those things. And similarly, I think RustUp is like something to consider really. It's an important piece to consider because we tell people in the installation instructions of Rust that they should run a shell command. And I'm not going to go into the debate of whether or not this is good. I know people have strong opinions on this in both ways, but this is something that we need to protect because, again, having something on here that in the worst case is malicious is something that will immediately destroy a lot of the trust that we've built up over years. And finally, kind of to give you a little bit of a glance at like what's happening behind the scenes a little bit, we're spending a ton of time and effort to think about access control and permissions within, especially our GitHub organization. The Rust project has over 400 members. Like I checked the internal Teams repo where we have 500 people listed there. And we have 240 repositories, which is too much for any one of us to kind of maintain manually. We cannot control permissions for an org of that size in the same way as we did when we started. So in particular, like Jakob, one of the members of the infra team, has done a ton of work to move all of that into automated tooling so that we know that when people join teams, they get the permissions that they need to do their work, but also when people leave the project, when they leave teams, when they move to other teams, the permissions get updated adequately so that we don't have people or that we don't have repositories where people still have access from 8 years ago, because once in a while, sometime in the past, they were a contributor. And why I want to kind of share those examples is that I think as Rust becomes critical infrastructure, we really have to reconsider our risk profile. Because we're in all the major operating systems in the world now. And what everyone in the industry is talking about right now is this topic of supply chain security, which, if you're not familiar with the term, it means we all depend on other projects. And if one of those projects has a security incident, we have the security incident as well. And the two major examples for this that I want to talk about is like SolarWinds and Log4Shell. SolarWinds in 2020 was a supply chain attack on a company called SolarWinds, which does like some security software. And someone managed to infiltrate their build system and put a backdoor into the SolarWinds software, which gave them access to all systems, essentially, of SolarWinds customers. So by penetrating a single piece of software, attackers were able to access thousands of other systems, which were run, or like companies of SolarWinds, customers of SolarWinds include the US government, the UK government, NATO, and just pretty much every Fortune 500 company. And the thing that was, I think, scary about SolarWinds is that it was not the work of some teenager with too much time and a passion to like try to break systems. SolarWinds, so as we kind of, or as the industry suspects, was done by a Russian state-sponsored hacker group, which is extremely well-funded and has a ton of time and resources to kind of invest into these attacks. And Log4Shell was a bug in Log4j, which is essentially like the logging framework in the Java ecosystem. Like every Java project, I would reckon, has Log4j in it. And through Log4j, or through Log4Shell, in this case, how this security vulnerability was called, it was really easy for attackers to just open a shell and execute arbitrary code. And of course, there's an XKCD for this scenario, because why wouldn't there be? And I think everyone has seen this. This is like, I think, one of the most famous XKCDs to go around. And it shows this problem where everything is like stacked. We all depend on other projects, and I think for us as Rust, it means we're somewhere in the middle of the stack. We rely on stuff that we need to make sure is safe and secure to use. But on the other side, people rely on Rust. And if we ever have like a security incident, it will bubble up the stack to everything that is built on top of us. And I think for us, it's really important to consider that as Rust becomes a more critical piece of infrastructure and as more things are built on top of us, this problem just gets increasingly worse. Because as we've seen with SolarWinds, we're not talking about threats from, I want to say like bored teens. And the joke that I like to make with my colleagues sometimes is like that the biggest risk to like the uptime of Crates.io is me, because as we've seen, I am a threat to the uptime of our services. But I think as we look ahead of like the next 10 or like 5 to 10 years, risk is changing. I'm no longer the biggest threat to our ecosystem. It's becoming these, in the worst case, like nation-state funded groups who want to infiltrate Rust to gain access to a ton of other systems. And especially as we talk about kind of the infrastructure team and the infrastructure that we are managing, it changes how we need to work, because suddenly it's not just us making mistakes, it's someone trying to mess with our systems, essentially. And it's one of the reasons why I'm really happy to give a quick shout out here as well, that the Rust Foundation got funding through Alpha Omega to invest into the security of the Rust ecosystem and the Rust project, which has allowed the foundation to hire 2 people who full-time work on nothing else than trying to respond or like trying to address these concerns. And a ton of work has been done over the last year to really try to get clarity on kind of what is our threat profile, what are the risks that we need to manage in the future, and how can we address them. And in a sad way, this means more work for me. Like I get frequent pings on Slack from colleagues that there's stuff that I should be doing that I don't find time for. But it also means that there is now an attention on this problem, and that we're as a community are able to kind of move forward and improve our posture on this. And this is kind of how I want to end the talk a little bit. It's like, we as an infrastructure team, we have historically worked in the same spirit of the broader Rust project. We're a team of it. We, of course, share the same culture and the same values, which is mostly, or was often based around experimentation and exploration and innovation, trying out things. And I think it's really important to kind of consider that this is it's also a strength. It's something that how every one of us, I think, or a lot of contributors got into the project in the first place, by wanting to contribute to something in a kind of fun and spontaneous way. But I think as we consider these new risks, as we consider what Rust means to the world now, I think it's more and more important that we consider kind of stability and security for these parts of our infrastructure that we consider critical. And that means we also need to rethink how we work. Because this approach that was fine for, again, not in a negative way, but like a hobby project, it's not the same approach that will work for something that runs nuclear reactors. And to be fair, this is my favorite slide of the talk, because it allowed me to put like every corporate-sounding term that I could find on there. But I think there's a lot that has been learned in the industry, like in the IT industry in general, about how to run infrastructure, how to run services, and how to essentially have like professional operations. I think that's really kind of the term that I landed on. It's like, we as a team that runs infrastructure 24/7, we need to make sure that we do our job well. And for one, that means that we need to figure out like, what is it actually that we run? What are the assets that we manage? Who's responsible for them? What's their status? Are they patched? Are they not patched? What updates do we need to install? It's really something where I think we as a team need to get better, but it also is something that it's work, and it's not the fun kind of work. It's the work where you need to write documentation and check boxes, and that's boring. But what it will allow us is to have better change management. Because as people rely on Rust, we cannot simply change an API of one of our CDNs. We need to carefully communicate that change with the broader ecosystem so that people can adapt and change their services that rely on ours before we break everything. But that means that we need to kind of manage that change. And yeah, I know everyone loves change management, but I think it's really important for us to start considering this in a broader, kind of in the broader ecosystem, in the broader environment. How do the things that we do impact kind of downstream users of our systems? And to be able to do this, we need project management. Like, we need to be able to establish timelines and say, hey, in 6 months, we're going to do something, and we're actually going to do it this time. We're not going to postpone this forever, but also we're not going to do it in 2 weeks because someone has a free weekend. And project management is hard, especially in like an open source project as big and kind of as volatile and quickly moving as the Rust project. There's a ton of interdependencies, and it needs time. And it's something that I think, as we look at the team composition, for example, it's something that's really difficult to do in a volunteer-run organization where everyone is, where it's unpredictable when people have time. How are we supposed to have a timeline that goes like a few months into the future if we don't know who's available on the next day or the next weekend? And I think part of this is also we need more product ownership. We need to feel a stronger sense of ownership of the things that we run. It's not enough to build something in a weekend because it's fun and deploy it to production and then hand it off or think it will run forever like this. The things that we run, we really, really need to maintain. We need to update them. We need to monitor them. We need to make sure that they are not becoming a security issue. And that's a different kind of culture and philosophy. And it's something that also requires, again, like this longer time horizon, which I don't know how to combine it well with like open source, where, we don't know how long people will stick around. So maybe we have a contributor who builds an awesome service for us, but like, how do we then take ownership of that and make sure that we can maintain it in the far future? And kind of the bottom line here is that all of this is starting to sound like a job. And I couldn't decide whether or not I want to go with the boring yawn emoji or like the two professionals. But I think it's a very important kind of message here that as Rust becomes critical infrastructure, as our profile changes, it's not fun anymore. Or I don't want to say it's not fun anymore, but there will be friction. We need to write documentation. We need to test things. We need to coordinate with people. We will need to have a ton of conversations around how we actually deploy something in a safe way. And making a change and just deploying this, I think for these critical pieces of infrastructure is not something that we even want to be able to do. I don't want to be in a position where I can accidentally bring down the Rust ecosystem because I make a mistake in a configuration. But that also means that I will not be able to make changes as quickly as I'm able to make changes now. It will require coordination with colleagues and with other stakeholders, which means suddenly it's not as easy to just make a change on a Saturday and have it live on Sunday. It might mean that we need to coordinate in the team around time zones when people are available to approve access to critical systems, for example. And what I really kind of want to end on is this question of how we can kind of maintain the best of both worlds. How can we maintain the spirit that exists in a project of this open source culture where we are open and transparent, where we encourage experimentation and exploration, and where we allow people to come in and learn and grow and make mistakes in the project, because honestly, this is how every one of us started. I chatted with a few folks in the project in the last few days, and I think everyone agrees that we got merge rights when we didn't feel ready for merge rights yet. And we want to maintain this culture. We want to give people the benefit of the doubt. We want to help other people join the project in the future as well. We don't want to pull the ladder up behind us. But on the other side, we also have to make sure that what we run is secure, it's safe, people can't tamper with it. We need to protect it from ourselves to a certain extent, where it's not that I don't trust my colleagues, but I also don't want my colleagues to make mistakes that bring down grades I/O. So how do we balance those two cultures with each other? And how can we ensure that in this world that we run a team that is reliable and responsible and able to kind of face this insane growth that we're experiencing? And like I said, I don't have an answer for this. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and why this is a talk that I wanted to give from my experience and not as I didn't want to talk about the infrastructure in depth or about the work that the foundation is doing. I really wanted to talk about something that's very close to my heart, because as a team lead of the project, this is what I'm thinking about. It is how can we shape the team in such a way that it can respond to the demands of the next 5 to 10 or 20 years while maintaining the culture and the spirit that it currently has. And yeah, if anyone wants to talk about this, find me later, because I love to chat. And with that, I really want to thank you. And yeah, appreciate you coming.